Everyone in Hollow Ridge, Nebraska, thought Ivy Caldwell had finally lost her mind. When the 15-year-old girl began digging a massive reservoir in the middle of her grandfather Walter Caldwell's best wheat field, the entire community laughed. Farmers shook their heads. Neighbors called it a waste of prime cropland. The county extension agent warned that she was destroying the soil structure. Dale Ketchum, who owned the largest spread in Saunders County and sat on the school board, drove his new Ford pickup past the property every morning at 7:30, slowing down just enough to let his cattle dog bark at the fence line while he shook his head in theatrical disappointment. At the hardware store, men gathered around the coffee pot and traded theories about what had snapped in Walter Caldwell's granddaughter. Some said it was grief over her grandmother's death. Others said it was the influence of those environmental documentaries she watched on her phone. Sheriff Norma Halloway even stopped by the farm one Tuesday afternoon, not to arrest anyone, but to ask Walter if his granddaughter needed counseling. The whole town watched, convinced that Ivy was destroying something valuable. But Ivy wasn't acting on a whim. For 3 years, she had quietly studied the land, noticing mysterious clues that nobody else paid attention to. It started with a quilt. When Ivy was 12, her grandmother Eleanor Caldwell passed away in the winter, quietly, in her sleep, with the smell of cinnamon and old wool still in the room. The family gathered. The funeral passed, and weeks later, when the attic was being cleared, Ivy found a cedar chest pushed against the rafters beneath a circle of frost. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled of lavender and dust, lay Eleanor's wedding quilt. But this was no ordinary quilt. The patchwork didn't follow the traditional wedding ring pattern that Nebraska farm wives favored. Instead, it showed a topographical map of the Caldwell property, stitched in threads of brown and gold and deep blue. Ivy had stared at it for an hour, spread across her bedroom floor, before she realized what she was seeing. The brown patches matched the elevated ridges. The gold threads followed the seasonal drainage paths. And the blue was the strange part. There were blue stitches running beneath the southeast corner of the property, deep blue, almost navy, forming a shape that looked like a bowl turned upside down. Beneath the quilt lay a folded piece of paper, brittle at the edges, dated 1912. It was a United States Geological Survey map, hand-annotated by someone named E. Caldwell, not Eleanor, but Edith, Eleanor's grandmother. The map showed a natural depression in the southeast field, marked with a single word in faded pencil, cistern, and below that, in Edith's cramped handwriting, the land remembers. The water waits, but only for those who dig in the right place. Ivy didn't show the quilt to anyone. She folded it back into the cedar chest and slid it under her bed, but she began to watch. She noticed that after every spring rain, the southeast corner of the wheat field stayed muddy 2 weeks longer than the rest of the property. She noticed that the cottonwood trees along the back fence, which everyone said were dying, always had greener leaves on the side facing that low spot. She noticed that when the wind blew from the south, the grass in that depression moved differently, thicker, heavier, as if the roots below were drinking something the rest of the field wasn't. She spent her summers walking the property with a soil auger she bought at a garage sale for $3, taking coarse samples and laying them in rows on the back porch. The topsoil was the same everywhere, dark loess, rich and predictable. But 18 inches down in the southeast corner, the soil changed. It became sandy, then gravelly, then full of crushed white stone that looked like ancient seashells pulverized by time. Her grandfather, Walter, when she showed him one of the cores, had squinted at it and said, "That's old lake bed stuff, before the prairie, before the wheat. That's from when water ruled this land." He hadn't asked why she was digging. He had simply handed the core back and said, Your grandmother always said that corner was special. She said her grandmother told her the same thing. I never paid it much mind. Wheat grows good there. That's all I needed to know. But Ivy needed to know more. She spent her freshman year at Hollow Ridge High School reading every book the library had on Nebraska hydrology. She learned about the ancient Lake Agassiz, which had covered the northern plains thousands of years ago, leaving behind deposits of sand and gravel that created isolated water lenses beneath the modern soil. She learned about hardpan clay layers that could act as natural bowls, trapping water above bedrock. She learned that the Ogallala Aquifer, which everyone in Nebraska depended on, was dropping. Wells that had flowed since the 1940s were beginning to sputter. The old-timers at the grain elevator talked about it constantly, blaming center pivot irrigation, blaming climate, blaming everything except the simple math of taking more than the land could give. Ivy saw the connection that nobody else saw: the quilt, the map, the lakebed gravel, the hardpan, the cottonwoods. The southeast corner wasn't just a wet spot. It was a natural cistern, buried under a century of wheat roots, waiting for someone to remove the lid. She made her decision on a Saturday in March, 3 weeks after her 15th birthday. The ground was still frozen, but she could feel spring coming in the way the wind smelled. She went to her grandfather and asked permission to dig. Not a pond. Ponds were for fishing and aesthetics, and this town had seen enough failed farm ponds turn into mosquito bogs. She asked to dig a reservoir, a real one, 80 feet wide, 12 feet deep at the center, sloped sides, with a clay liner and an overflow channel. She had drawn the plans on graph paper during biology class, calculating the catchment area, the evaporation rates, the seasonal rainfall averages. Walter had looked at the plans for a long time, his reading glasses sliding down his nose, his hands trembling slightly from the arthritis that was slowly bending his fingers. "That's 3 acres of wheat," he said quietly. 3 acres that fed this family since 1952. Ivy nodded. She didn't argue. She simply pointed to the core samples lined up on the kitchen table, and to the quilt which she had finally brought downstairs and spread across the sofa. Walter looked at the quilt for a long time. Then he looked out the window at the southeast corner, where the snow was melting faster than everywhere else. "Your grandmother," he said, his voice cracking. "She tried to tell me once. In 1987, when we had that bad drought, she said we should dig there. I told her we needed every acre for wheat. I told her dreams don't pay the mortgage." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key ring. "The old backhoe is in the machine shed. The starter's been sticky since Clinton was president. But if you can get her running, you can dig." The machine took 4 days to resurrect. Ivy cleaned the carburetor with solvent from the hardware store, replaced the fuel lines that had turned to powder, and spent 6 hours with a voltmeter tracing a short in the ignition. When the engine finally coughed to life on a Thursday morning, blowing black smoke into the Nebraska sky, the sound carried all the way to the Ketchum property. Dale Ketchum was there within the hour, leaning on his truck door, watching Ivy guide the backhoe's first bite into the frozen earth. "Walter," he called out, though Walter was inside and couldn't hear him. "Walter, your girl's lost her ever-loving mind. You know what 3 acres of wheat is worth in this market? You know what that equipment costs to run?" He turned to the small crowd that had gathered, the mail carrier, 2 fertilizer salesmen, and the Hendrickson twins who were supposed to be in school. "She's digging a swimming hole in the middle of breadbasket land. That's not farming. That's not even thinking. That's whatever comes after thinking stops." The crowd laughed. Ivy didn't look up. She was watching the soil. The first 18 inches came up easily, the thawed loess, dark and loamy, smelling of decay and renewal. Then the backhoe hit the subsoil and the work slowed. The clay was thick here, gray, blue, and heavy, the kind of gumbo that stuck to the bucket and had to be scraped free with a shovel. Ivy worked from dawn until dark, stopping only to eat sandwiches her grandfather left on the porch railing. The hole grew. By the end of the first week, it was 40 feet across and 4 feet deep, a raw wound in the wheat field, filling slowly with meltwater and spring rain. The town's ridicule grew with it. Someone spray-painted pond scum on the Caldwell mailbox. The Hollow Ridge Gazette ran a brief item on page 4, calling it a puzzling excavation project by a local teen that has farmers concerned about property values. Dale Ketchum told anyone who would listen that Walter Caldwell was letting his granddaughter play construction worker while his wheat rotted. At the grain co-op, the joke became standard greeting. "Hey, you dig any reservoirs lately?" But Ivy wasn't listening to the jokes. She was listening to the ground. At 5 feet deep, the clay changed. It became harder, more compact, and it began to show a structure that Ivy recognized from her research. It was hardpan, a natural cemented layer formed by minerals leaching down and binding the soil particles together over centuries. This was the lid. This was what had kept the ancient cistern sealed. But as she worked, she noticed something else. The hardpan wasn't uniform. There were veins in it, lighter streaks where water had once moved through, creating channels of less compacted material. She took a mason jar, filled it with chunks of the hardpan, and added water. The jar sat on her windowsill for 3 days. On the third morning, the water had seeped into the lighter veins and softened them, while the dark clay remained rock hard. Ivy understood then. The hardpan was both a seal and a filter. If she could remove the hardpan carefully, breaking it along the natural veins, she could create a bowl that would hold water without any artificial liner. The ancient lakebed gravel beneath would act as a natural drainage bed, preventing the water from becoming stagnant, while the hardpan walls would prevent it from seeping away. It was engineering that had been started by glaciers and finished by time. All she had to do was uncover it. She started breaking the hardpan with a pickaxe, working by hand because the backhoe was too crude for the precision she needed. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her shoulders ached in the morning so badly that she could barely lift her cereal spoon. Her grandfather watched from the porch, saying nothing. But she saw him counting the days on his calendar, marking off the planting season that was slipping away. The reservoir was now 8 feet deep in the center, and the exposed walls showed beautiful stratigraphy, bands of clay, then sand, then a layer of white crushed limestone that glittered in the sun like bone. Ivy recognized the limestone from her reading. It was the remnant of an ancient reef, deposited when Nebraska had been shallow sea. The limestone meant that bedrock was close, maybe only 4 feet below, and bedrock meant a floor, a natural floor for her bowl. She worked faster, then came the setback. A week into April, with the reservoir 9 feet deep and 60 feet across, a spring storm rolled in. Not the gentle Nebraska rains, but a gully washer, a thunderstorm that dropped 3 inches of water in 90 minutes. The reservoir, still raw and unlined, became a muddy soup. The sides slumped. The southeast wall collapsed, sending tons of saturated clay cascading into the bottom. Ivy stood at the edge in her yellow rain slicker, watching 2 weeks of work disappear under a landslide of gray mud. Dale Ketchum drove by during the storm, his headlights cutting through the rain, and she heard him honk twice. Not a friendly greeting, but a mocking punctuation mark. The next morning, the damage was worse than she'd thought. The collapse had exposed a section of hardpan that was now cracked, and water was seeping out through the crack, draining the reservoir from the bottom. The townspeople who came to gawk said the same thing. "Told you so. Ground's too porous. You can't hold water in Nebraska clay. It'll just sink to China." Ivy spent 3 days bailing the mud with a bucket and a rope, her arms shaking with exhaustion. She was behind schedule. The planting window was closing. Her grandfather had quietly sold 50 head of cattle to cover the fuel costs for the backhoe, and she had seen the checkbook on his desk, the numbers written in his shaky hand, the balance shrinking toward a red line she didn't want to think about. She was costing him money. She was costing him pride. She was costing him the respect of a town that had already decided she was a fool. On the third night, after bailing until her hands bled, Ivy sat at the edge of the reservoir and cried. Not quiet tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes from deep in the chest, from the place where hope and doubt fight their final battle. She looked at the quilt which she had hung on the wall of the machine shed, and at the 1912 map, now water-stained and fragile. She thought about her grandmother Eleanor, who had tried to tell her grandfather to dig in 1987 and had been ignored. She thought about Edith, who had marked the cistern in 1912, and she thought about the water somewhere below her, waiting. She picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. She approached the cracked hardpan differently now. Instead of trying to patch it, she decided to follow it. She chipped away at the crack, widening it carefully, following the path of least resistance. The hardpan was telling her where it wanted to break. She simply had to listen. For 2 days, she chipped and scraped, following a vein of lighter material that angled down and to the north. At 10 feet below the original surface, the vein opened into a small cavity, no bigger than a watermelon. And from that cavity, Ivy heard something that made her drop her tools. It was a sound like wind through a tunnel, but softer, like breathing. She put her ear to the opening and listened. From somewhere deep in the earth, she heard water moving. Not a river, not a stream, but the slow, patient percolation of groundwater, traveling through ancient gravel, filtered through limestone, moving toward some lower place that it had been seeking for 10,000 years. She had found the cistern's heart, but finding it wasn't enough. The cavity was too small, the flow too weak. She needed to connect it to the main reservoir, to create a system where the ancient water could rise and mingle with the surface catchment. She spent another week carefully expanding the cavity, shoring up the walls with fieldstone so nothing would collapse, creating a channel that led back up to the reservoir floor. She worked alone, telling no one, not even her grandfather. This was her secret now, her layered discovery. The first layer had been the quilt, the second had been the hardpan bowl. The third was this, a living connection to the deep water, a natural artesian seep that had been trapped beneath the hardpan for generations. When she finally broke through the last wall of clay and let the ancient water flow into the reservoir channel, it came slowly at first, a trickle the color of weak tea, full of minerals and thyme, then faster, clearer, until it was a steady stream the width of her wrist, filling the bottom of the reservoir with water that was cold enough to make her fingers ache. She sat on the edge and dangled her feet in it, and for the first time in months, she smiled. The town didn't know about the spring. All they saw was a muddy hole in a wheat field, now partially filled with murky water that looked like every other failed farm pond in Saunders County. Dale Ketchum continued his daily drive-bys. The graffiti on the mailbox changed from pond scum to water witch, which some of the old German ladies in town meant as an insult, though Ivy would have accepted it as a compliment. School became difficult. The Hendrickson twins started a rumor that she had dropped out, even though she was still attending, still getting A's in biology and earth science, still sitting alone at lunch while the other girls talked about prom dresses and summer jobs at the mall in Lincoln. Her only friend was the land itself, and the water that now covered the bottom of the reservoir in a dark, secret pool. She began the next phase of her work, shaping the slopes, planting native switchgrass on the berm to prevent erosion, laying flat stones on the inlet channel to filter the sediment. She was building something that was half ancient and half new, something that belonged to the prairie but served the people. She didn't know if anyone would ever appreciate it. She only knew that the water was rising, inch by inch, week by week, and that the cottonwood trees along the back fence had never looked so green. Then the drought came, not the slow, creeping drought that Nebraska sometimes endured, the kind that stole moisture so gradually that you didn't notice until the corn curled. This was a flash drought, born of a high-pressure system that parked itself over the Great Plains and refused to move. For 63 days, no rain fell. The sky was a brutal, cloudless blue. The wheat, which should have been heading out in golden waves, turned gray and brittle. The soybeans that Dale Ketchum had planted on 3,000 acres began to wither at the cotyledon stage, and one by one, the wells of Hollow Ridge began to fail. It started with the shallow wells. The Hendrickson place, which drew from 30 feet, went dry on a Tuesday. Mrs. Pruitt's well, behind the elementary school, began pumping sand on Thursday. By the second week, the deeper wells were feeling the strain. The Ketchum operation, which relied on a 100-foot agricultural well for its center pivot systems, watched the pressure gauge drop day by day. The county declared a water emergency. The National Guard brought tanker trucks from Lincoln, but there were only 2 trucks for a town of 900 people, and the lines at the distribution point stretched for blocks. People watered their livestock with bottled water. They flushed toilets with creek water that was itself disappearing. The Hollow Ridge Gazette, which had mocked Ivy's Reservoir, now ran front-page photos of cracked earth and dead cattle, with headlines that screamed "Water War" and the drying of the plans. Ivy watched it happen from her grandfather's porch. The reservoir, now full to the brim with a combination of spring rain, ancient seepage, and the steady flow from the deep cavity, looked like an alien thing in the burnt landscape. While the surrounding fields turned to dust, the water in the reservoir stayed. It didn't evaporate as quickly as it should have, because the hardpan walls kept the temperature cool, and the deep spring fed it from below, replacing what the sun stole. The cottonwoods, which had always been the first to show stress in dry years, remained fully leafed, their roots drinking from the moisture that seeped through the hardpan into the surrounding subsoil. Ivy began to realize something that made her hands shake. The reservoir wasn't just holding water. It was creating a microclimate. The cool water was condensing moisture from the night air. The seepage from the hardpan was traveling laterally through the gravel lens, feeding the roots of plants in a radius that extended far beyond the reservoir's edge. She had built not just a water tank, but a groundwater recharge system. The land was drinking, and she had given it a straw. Dale Ketchum came on the 65th day. He didn't drive his pickup. He walked. Ivy was on the berm, checking the switchgrass, when she saw him coming across the field, his boots kicking up dust that hung in the air like brown smoke. He was a big man, 6'2", with a belly that pressed against his belt buckle and a face that had spent 50 years squinting into the wind. He stopped 10 feet from the water's edge and looked at the reservoir. It was full, not just full, but alive. Dragonflies hovered over the surface. The water was so clear that he could see the stones on the bottom, 20 feet down. He could see the channel where the ancient spring entered, bubbling gently, creating ripples that spread across the whole surface. He stood there for a long time, his shadow stretching behind him in the evening light. Then he took off his hat. It wasn't a gesture of greeting. It was something older, something like surrender. "Ivy," he said, and his voice was different from the booming authority he used at school board meetings. It was small, it was dry, it was ashamed. "My well's gone, My backup well's gone. I've got 2,000 head of cattle that haven't had a drink in 36 hours. The tanker trucks are 3 days out. The creek's a crack in the ground." He stopped. He looked at the water. "I told everyone you were crazy. I told Walter he should stop you. I told the bank you were destroying property values." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong, and I'm begging you." Ivy didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the man who had mocked her for months, who had turned the town against her, who had made her high school life a quiet hell of whispers and graffiti. She looked at the reservoir, which had cost her grandfather 3 acres of wheat, thousands of dollars in equipment, and the last of his savings. She thought about the blisters that had turned to calluses, the nights she had cried into her pillow, the days she had wanted to quit. Then she looked past Dale Ketchum to the road beyond the fence where a line of pickup trucks was forming. She saw Sheriff Norma Halloway's cruiser. She saw the Hendrickson twins' beat-up Chevy. She saw Mrs. Pruitt's Subaru with the elementary school bumper sticker. They had all come. They had all watched her dig. They had all laughed, and now they had all come to drink. "You can have the water," Ivy said quietly, "but I need something in return." Dale Ketchum looked up, fear flickering in his eyes. He was ready for revenge. He was ready for her to humiliate him, to make him crawl, to charge him money he didn't have. "I need you to help me plant the buffer," Ivy said. "Native grasses, switchgrass, Indian grass, bluestem around the whole reservoir, 20 feet deep. And I need everyone who takes water from here to promise that they'll never plant corn within 50 feet of the edge. Corn drinks too deep. It'll pull the water away from the spring. We need shallow-rooted prairie plants to hold the soil and filter the runoff. The reservoir isn't just a tank. It's a living thing, and living things need protection." Dale Ketchum stared at her. Then he did something that Hollow Ridge would talk about for the next 20 years. He knelt, right there in the dust, in his $1,000 boots and his seed company jacket. He knelt on one knee and put his hand on the ground. "I'll plant it myself," he said, "tonight, with a flashlight if I have to, and I'll make sure every farmer in Saunders County knows that this water comes with rules. Your rules." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Ivy. I was so sure I knew this land. I've farmed it for 50 years. But I never listened to it. You did, and I was too proud to hear what it was saying." The next morning, the town brought hoses and pumps and portable tanks. Walter Caldwell, who had watched from his porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands, finally walked out to the reservoir. He moved slowly, his arthritis making every step a negotiation with gravity, but he made it to the water's edge. He looked at the clear pool, at the cottonwoods, at the line of trucks waiting to fill up. He looked at his granddaughter, who was showing the Hendrickson twins how to lay sod on the berm, and he took the quilt from under his arm, the quilt he had retrieved from her bedroom that morning, and spread it on the grass. The blue stitches caught the sunlight. The brown ridges matched the land around them. The gold threads followed the same paths that the water now traveled. "Eleanor tried to tell me," he said to no one in particular. "In '87, she said the land had a memory. She said water never forgets where it wants to go. I told her we needed the wheat." He looked at Ivy. "I was wrong for 37 years, but you fixed it. You didn't just dig a hole, baby. You dug up the truth." The drought lasted another 6 weeks. During that time, Ivy's reservoir became the heart of Hollow Ridge. The school used it to keep the football field alive. The fire department filled its tankers from the overflow channel. Farmers hauled water to their livestock in trailers, and though it wasn't enough to save every crop, it was enough to save the herds, the gardens, the orchards, and the town itself. The reservoir didn't just provide water. It provided hope. It proved that the land still had secrets, still had generosity, still had answers for those who asked the right questions. And slowly, the shallow wells around the Caldwell property began to recover. Not immediately, but week by week the water table rose. The geologist from the University of Nebraska, who came to study the phenomenon, explained it simply. By exposing the deep artesian seep and creating a surface reservoir, Ivy had established a pressure equilibrium. The reservoir acted as a recharge point, allowing the deep groundwater to percolate upward and outward, feeding the depleted shallow aquifer like a transfusion. The land, which had been sucked dry by decades of overpumping, was drinking again. And it was drinking from a cup that a 15-year-old girl had carved out of clay and stubbornness. When the rains finally returned in late June, they came in a storm that turned the sky purple and filled the reservoir to overflowing. The overflow channel, which Ivy had designed to feed into a series of small wetlands she had planted downstream, carried the excess water through the prairie in a ribbon of life that attracted ducks, herons, and foxes that hadn't been seen near Hollow Ridge in decades. Dale Ketchum, true to his word, had planted 20 acres of native prairie grass along the reservoir's watershed, and by autumn, it stood 6 feet tall, a wall of gold and burgundy that swayed in the wind like an ocean. The county extension agent, who had warned Ivy about destroying the soil, wrote a paper about her design that was published in the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture. He sent her a copy with a note that said, "You taught me that the best engineering is the kind that was already here before we arrived." Ivy went back to school in the fall as a junior. The Hendrickson twins, who had started the dropout rumor, asked her to sit with them at lunch. She said yes, but she still spent her afternoons at the reservoir, watching the water level, checking the switchgrass, listening to the spring that had become her companion. She never told anyone about the sound she heard when she put her ear to the cavity, that breathing, that ancient pulse. Some things were meant to be shared, and some things were meant to be kept between a girl and the land she had learned to hear. On the 1-year anniversary of the day she started digging, Walter Caldwell took her to the courthouse and signed over the deed to the southeast corner, 3 acres that would never again grow wheat. "It's yours," he said. "The reservoir, the spring, the cottonwoods, and whatever else you find down there, because you saw what I couldn't, you heard what I wouldn't, and you loved this land enough to argue with it until it gave up its secret." Ivy didn't know what to say. She hugged him, feeling his thin frame against her, smelling the wool and the pipe tobacco that still clung to his shirt. Then she walked out to the reservoir alone, sat on the stone edge she had laid with her own bleeding hands, and dangled her feet in the water. The sun was setting over Nebraska, turning the prairie into a sea of fire, and the water beneath her was dark and cool and endless. She thought about Eleanor, stitching the map by lamplight, her fingers moving through fabric like a dowser's rod through earth. She thought about Edith, marking the cistern in 1912 with a pencil that probably cost a penny. She thought about the lake that had once covered this land, and the glaciers that had carried the gravel, and the rain that had fallen 10,000 years ago, and was still falling, still cycling, still remembering. And she thought about the future, not her future, but the land's. The prairie didn't need more wells. It didn't need more center pivots sucking the ancient water into the sky. It needed people who would listen, people who would dig not to take, but to uncover. People who understood that the best way to hold water was to let the land hold it first. The water rippled. A fish jumped. One of the native sunfish she had stocked in the spring, a species that had once filled Nebraska's sloughs before the drainage tiles and the plows. The cottonwoods rustled, and somewhere deep below the hardpan, in the gravel that remembered ice ages, the ancient stream continued its patient journey toward the sea. Ivy Caldwell sat there until the stars came out, until the water matched the sky. until she couldn't tell where the reservoir ended and the universe began. She was 15 years old. She had been ridiculed by an entire town. She had lost her savings, her social standing, and 3 months of sleep. But she had found something that no amount of money could buy. She had found the voice of the land, and she had learned, finally and forever, that some truths are buried not to hide them, but to wait for the one person stubborn enough to dig them up.